The Golden Cup and the Dish of Silver by Thomas Hood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Everyone knows what a dog's life the miserable Jews lead all over the world, but especially among the Turks, who plunder them of their riches and slay them on the most frivolous pretences. Thus, if they acquire any wealth, they are obliged to hide it in holes and corners, and to snatch their scanty enjoyments by stealth, in recompense of the buffets and contumely of their turbaned oppressors. In this manner lived Yusuf, a Hebrew of great wealth and wisdom, but outwardly a poor beggarly druggist, inhabiting with his wife Anna one of the meanest houses in Constantinople. The curse of his nation had often fallen bitterly upon his head, his great skill in medicine procuring him some uncertain favour from the Turks, but on the failure of his remedies a tenfold proportion of ill usage and contempt. In such cases 100 blows on the soles of his feet were his common payment, whereas on the happiest cures he was often dismissed with empty hands and some epithet of disgrace. As he was sitting one day at his humble door, thinking over these miseries, a Janizary came up to him, and commanded Yusuf to go with him to his Aga, or captain, whose palace was close at hand. Yusuf's gold immediately weighed heavy as his heart, as the cause of this summons. However, he rose obediently, and followed the soldier to the Aga, who was sitting cross-legged on a handsome carpet, with his long pipe in his mouth. The Jew, casting himself on his knees, with his face to the floor, began, like his brethren, to plead poverty in excuse for the shabbiness of his appearance. But the Aga, interrupting him, proceeded to compliment him in a flattering strain on his reputation for wisdom, which he said had made him desirous of his conversation. He then ordered the banquet to be brought in, whereupon the slaves put down before them some wine in a golden cup, and some pork in a dish of silver, both of which were forbidden things, and therefore made the Jew wonder very much at such an entertainment. The Aga then, pointing to the refreshments, addressed him as follows: Yusuf, they say you are a very wise and learned man, and have studied deeper than any one the mysteries of nature. I have sent for you, therefore, to resolve me on certain doubts concerning this flesh and this liquor before us, the pork being as abominable to your religion as the wine is unto ours. But I am especially curious to know the reasons why your prophet should have forbidden a meat, which, by report of the Christians, is both savoury and wholesome. Wherefore I will have you proceed first with that argument, and, in order that you may not discuss it negligently, I am resolved, in case you fail to justify the prohibition, that you shall empty the silver dish before you stir from the place. Nevertheless, to show you that I am equally candid, I promise, if you shall thereafter prove to me the unreasonableness of the injunction against wine, I will drink off this golden goblet as frankly before we part. The terrified Jew understood very readily the purpose of this trial. However, after a secret prayer to Moses, he began in the best way he could to plead against the abominable dish that was steaming under his nostrils. He failed, notwithstanding, to convince the sceptical Aga, who, therefore, commanded him to eat up the pork, and then begin his discourse in favour of the wine. The sad Jew, at this order, endeavoured to move the obdurate Turk by his tears, but the Aga was resolute, and drawing his crooked scimitar, declared that if Yusuf did not instantly fall to, he would smite his head from his shoulders. It was time, at this threat, for Yusuf to commend his soul unto heaven, for in Turkey the Jews wear their heads very loosely. However, by dint of fresh tears and supplications, he obtained a respite of 3 days, to consider if he could not bring forward any further arguments. As soon as the audience was over, Yussuf returned disconsolately to his house, and informed his wife Anna of what had passed between him and the Aga. The poor woman foresaw clearly how the matter would end, for it was aimed only at the confiscation of their riches. She advised Yussuf, therefore, instead of racking his wits for fresh arguments, to carry a bag of gold to the Aga, who condescended to receive his reasons, and after another brief discourse, to grant him a respite of 3 days longer. In the same manner Yussuf procured a further interval, but somewhat dearer, so that in despair at losing his money at this rate, he returned for the 4th time to the palace. The Aga and Yussuf being seated as before, with the mess of pork and the wine between them, the Turk asked if he had brought any fresh arguments. The doctor replied, alas, he had already discussed the subject so often that his reasons were quite exhausted. Whereupon, the flashing scimitar leaping quickly out of its scabbard, the trembling Hebrew plucked the loathsome dish towards him, and with many struggles began to eat. It cost him 1,000 wry faces to swallow the first morsel, and from the laughter that came from behind a silken screen, they were observed by more mockers beside the Aga, who took such a cruel pleasure in the amusement of his women, that Yussuf was compelled to proceed even to the licking of the dish. He was then suffered to depart, without wasting any logic upon the cup of wine, which after his loathsome meal he would have been quite happy to discuss. I guess not how the Jew consoled himself besides for his involuntary sin, but he bitterly cursed the cruel Aga and all his wives, who could not amuse their indolent lives with their dancing girls and tale-tellers, but made merry at the expense of his soul. His wife joined heartily in his imprecations, and both putting ashes on their heads, they mourned and cursed together till the sun set. There came no janissary, however, on the morrow, as they expected, but on the 8th day Yussuf was summoned again to the Aga. The Jew at this message began to weep, making sure in his mind that a fresh dish of pork was prepared for him. However, he repaired obediently to the palace, where he was told that the favourite lady of the harem was indisposed, and the Aga commanded him to prescribe for her. Now the Turks are very jealous of their mistresses, and disdain especially to expose them to the eyes of infidels, of whom the Jews are held the most vile. Wherefore, when Yussuf begged to see his patient, she was allowed to be brought forth only in a long white veil that reached down to her feet. The Aga, notwithstanding the folly of such a proceeding, forbade her veil to be lifted. Neither would he permit the Jew to converse with her, but commanded him on pain of death to return home and prepare his medicines. The wretched doctor, groaning all the way, went back to his house, without wasting a thought on what drugs he should administer on so hopeless a case, but considering instead the surgical practice of the Aga, which separated so many necks. However, he told his wife of the new jeopardy he was placed in for the Moorish Jezebel. A curse take her, said Anna. Give her a dose of poison, and let her perish before his eyes. Nay, answered the Jew, that will be to pluck the sword down upon our own heads. Nevertheless, I will cheat the infidel's concubine with some wine, which is equally damnable to their souls, and may God visit upon their conscience the misery they have enforced upon mine. In this bitter mood, going to a filthy hole in the floor, he drew out a flask of Shiraz, and bestowing as many Hebrew curses on the liquor as the Mussulmans are wont to utter of blessings over their medicines, he filled up some physic bottles, and repaired with them to the palace. And now let the generous virtues of good wine be duly lauded for the happy sequel. The illness of the favourite being merely a languor and melancholy, proceeding from the voluptuous indolence of her life, the draughts of Yusuf soon dissipated her chagrin, in such a miraculous manner that she sang and danced more gaily than any of her slaves. The Aga, therefore, instead of beheading Yusuf, returned to him all the purses of gold he had taken, to which the grateful lady besides added a valuable ruby, and henceforward, when she was ill, would have none but the Jewish physician. Thus Yusuf saved both his head and his money, and, besides, convinced the Aga of the virtues of good wine, so that the golden cup was finally emptied, as well as the dish of silver. End of The Golden Cup and the Dish of Silver, by Thomas Hood. Read by NoelBadrian. The Widow of Galicia, by Thomas Hood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There lived in the province of Galicia a lady so perfectly beautiful that she was called by travellers, and by all indeed who beheld her, the flower of Spain. It too frequently happens that such handsome women are but as beautiful weeds, useless or even noxious, whereas with her excelling charms she possessed all those virtues which should properly inhabit in so lovely a person. She had therefore many wooers, but especially a certain old knight of Castile, bulky in person and with hideously coarse features, who, as he was exceedingly wealthy, made the most tempting offers to induce her to become his mistress, and failing in that object by reason of her strict virtue, he proposed to espouse her. But she, despising him as a bad and brutal man, which was his character, let fall the blessing of her affection on a young gentleman of small estate but good reputation in the province, and being speedily married, they lived together for 3 years very happily. Notwithstanding this, the abominable knight did not cease to persecute her, till, being rudely checked by her husband, and threatened with his vengeance, he desisted for a season. It happened at the end of the 3rd year of their marriage, that her husband being unhappily murdered on his return from Madrid, whither he had been called by a lawsuit, she was left without protection, and, from the failure of the cause, much straitened besides in her means of living. This time, therefore, the knight thought favourable to renew his importunities, and neither respecting the sacredness of her grief, nor her forlorn state, he molested her so continually, that if it had not been for the love of her fatherless child, she would have been content to die. For if the knight was odious before, he was now thrice hateful from his undisguised brutality, and above all execrable in her eyes from a suspicion that he had procured the assassination of her dear husband. She was obliged, however, to confine this belief to her own bosom, for her persecutor was rich and powerful, and wanted not the means, and scarcely the will, to crush her. Many families had thus suffered by his malignity, and therefore she only awaited the arrangement of certain private affairs to withdraw secretly, with her scanty maintenance, into some remote village. There she hoped to be free from her inhuman suitor. But she was delivered from this trouble in the meantime by his death, yet in so terrible a manner as made it more grievous to her than his life had ever been. It wanted, at this event, but a few days of the time when the lady proposed to remove to her country lodging, taking with her a maid who was called Maria, for since the reduction of her fortune she had retained but this one servant. Now it happened that this woman, going one day to her lady's closet, which was in her bedchamber, so soon as she had opened the door, there tumbled forward the dead body of a man, and the police being summoned by her shrieks, they soon recognised the corpse to be that of the old Castilian knight, though the countenance was so blackened and disfigured as to seem scarcely human. it was sufficiently evident that he had perished by poison, whereupon the unhappy lady, being interrogated, was unable to give any account of the matter, and in spite of her fair reputation, and although she appealed to God in behalf of her innocence, she was thrown into the common jail along with other reputed murderers. The criminal addresses of the deceased knight being generally known, many persons who believed in her guilt still pitied her, and excused the cruelty of the deed on account of the persecution she had suffered from that wicked man. But these were the most charitable of her judges. The violent death of her husband, which before had been only attributed to robbers, was now assigned by scandalous persons to her own act, and the whole province was shocked that a lady of her fair seeming, and of such unblemished character, should have brought so heavy a disgrace upon her sex and upon human nature. At her trial, therefore, the court was crowded to excess, and some few generous persons were not without a hope of her acquittal. But the same facts as before being proved upon oath, and the lady still producing no justification, but only asserting her innocence, there remained no reasonable cause for doubting of her guilt. The public advocate then began to plead, as his painful duty commanded him, for her condemnation. He urged the facts of her acquaintance, and bad terms with the murdered knight, and, moreover, certain expressions of hatred which she had been heard to utter against him. The very scene and manner of his destruction, he said, spoke to her undoubted prejudice. The first a private closet in her own bedchamber, and the last by poison, which was likely to be employed by a woman rather than any weapon of violence. Afterwards he interpreted to the same conclusion the abrupt flight of the waiting maid, who, like a guilty and fearful accomplice, had disappeared whenever her mistress was arrested. And finally he recalled the still mysterious fate of her late husband, so that all who heard him began to bend their brows solemnly, and some reproachfully, on the unhappy object of his discourse. Still she upheld herself firmly and calmly, only from time to time lifting her eyes towards heaven. But when she heard the death of her dear husband touched upon, and in a manner that laid his blood to her charge, she stood forward, and placing her right hand on the head of her son, cried, "So witness God, if ever I shed his father's blood, so may this, his dear child, shed mine in vengeance." Then sinking down from exhaustion, and the child weeping bitterly over her, the beholders were again touched with compassion, almost to the doubting of her guilt. But the evidence being so strong against her, she was immediately condemned by the court. It was the custom in those days for a woman who had committed murder to be first strangled by the hangman, and then burnt to ashes in the midst of the market-place. But before this horrible sentence could be pronounced on the lady, a fresh witness was moved by the grace of God to come forward in her behalf. This was the waiting woman Maria, who hitherto had remained disguised in the body of the court. But now, being touched with remorse at her lady's unmerited distresses, she stood up on one of the benches, and called out earnestly to be allowed to make her confession. She then related that she herself had been prevailed upon by several great sums of money, and still more by the artful and seducing promises of the dead knight, to secrete him in a closet in her lady's chamber, but that of the cause of his death she knew nothing, except that upon a shelf she had placed some sweet cakes mixed with arsenic to poison the rats, and that the knight, being rather gluttonous, might have eaten of them in the dark, and so died. At this probable explanation the people all shouted one shout, and the lady's innocence being acknowledged, the sentence was ordered to be reversed. But she, reviving a little at the noise, and being told of this providence, only clasped her hands, and then, in a few words, commending her son to the guardianship of good men, and saying that she could never survive the shame of her unworthy reproach, she ended with a deep sigh, and expired upon the spot. End of the Widow of Galicia, by Thomas Hood. Read by NoelBadrian.
A Wireless Message by Ambrose Bierce. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Wireless Message. In the summer of 1896, Mr. William Holt, a wealthy manufacturer of Chicago, was living temporarily in a little town of central New York, the name of which the writer's memory has not retained. Mr. Holt had had trouble with his wife, from whom he had parted a year before. Whether the trouble was anything more serious than an incompatibility of temper, he is probably the only living person that knows. He is not addicted to the vice of confidences. Yet he has related the incident herein set down to at least one person without exacting a pledge of secrecy. He is now living in Europe. One evening he had left the house of a brother whom he was visiting, for a stroll in the country. It may be assumed, whatever the value of the assumption in connection with what is said to have occurred, that his mind was occupied with reflections on his domestic infelicities and the distressing changes that they had wrought in his life. Whatever may have been his thoughts, they so possessed him that he observed neither the lapse of time nor whither his feet were carrying him. He knew only that he passed far beyond the town limits, and was traversing a lonely region by a road that bore no resemblance to the one by which he had left the village. In brief, he was lost. Realizing his mischance, he smiled. Central New York is not a region of perils, nor does one long remain lost in it. He turned about and went back the way he had come. Before he had gone far, he observed that the landscape was growing more distinct, was brightening. Everything was suffused with a soft, red glow, in which he saw his shadow projected in the road before him. "The moon is rising," he said to himself. Then he remembered that it was about the time of the new moon, and if that tricksy orb was in one of its stages of visibility, it had set long before. He stopped and faced about, seeking the source of the rapidly broadening light. As he did so, his shadow turned and lay along the road in front of him, as before. The light still came from behind him. That was surprising. He could not understand. Again he turned, and again, facing successively to every point of the horizon. Always the shadow was before, always the light behind, a still and awful red. Holt was astonished. Dumbfounded is the word that he used in telling it, yet seems to have retained a certain intelligent curiosity. To test the intensity of the light, whose nature and cause he could not determine, he took out his watch to see if he could make out the figures on the dial. They were plainly visible, and the hands indicated the hour of 11 o'clock and 25 minutes. At that moment the mysterious illumination suddenly flared to an intense and almost blinding splendor, flushing the entire sky, extinguishing the stars, and throwing the monstrous shadow of himself athwart the landscape. In that unearthly illumination he saw near him, but apparently in the air at a considerable elevation, the figure of his wife, clad in her night clothing, and holding to her breast the figure of his child. Her eyes were fixed upon his with an expression which he afterward professed himself unable to name or describe. Further than that, it was not of this life. The flare was momentary, followed by black darkness, in which, however, the apparition still showed white and motionless. Then by insensible degrees it faded and vanished, like a bright image on the retina after the closing of the eyes. A peculiarity of the apparition, hardly noted at the time, but afterward recalled, was that it showed only the upper half of the woman's figure. Nothing was seen below the waist. The sudden darkness was comparative, not absolute, for gradually all objects of his environment became again visible. In the dawn of the morning Holt found himself entering the village at a point opposite to that at which he had left it. He soon arrived at the house of his brother, who hardly knew him. He was wild-eyed, haggard, and grey as a rat. Almost incoherently he related his night's experience. "Go to bed, my poor fellow," said his brother, "and wait, we shall hear more of this." An hour later came the predestined telegram. Holt's dwelling in one of the suburbs of Chicago had been destroyed by fire. Her escape cut off by the flames, his wife had appeared at an upper window, her child in her arms. There she had stood, motionless, apparently dazed. Just as the fireman had arrived with a ladder, the floor had given way, and she was seen no more. The moment of this culminating horror was 11 o'clock and 25 minutes, Standard Time. End of A Wireless Message by Ambrose Bierce. Read by Lynne Thompson. The Hydrophobic Skunk by Irvin S. Cobb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Hydrophobic Skunk. The hydrophobic skunk resides in the extreme bottom of the Grand Canyon, and, next to a Southern Republican who never asked for a federal office, is the rarest of living creatures. He is so rare that nobody ever saw him. That is, nobody except a native. I met plenty of tourists who had seen people who had seen him, but never a tourist who had seen him with his own eyes. In addition to being rare, he is highly gifted. I think almost anybody would agree with me that the common, ordinary skunk has been the most richly dowered by nature. To adorn a skunk with any extra qualifications seems as great a waste of the raw material as painting the lily or gilding refined gold. He is already amply equipped for outdoor pursuits. Nobody intentionally shoves him around. Everybody gives him as much room as he seems to need. He commands respect, nay, more than that, respect and veneration, wherever he goes. Joyriders never run him down, and foot passengers avoid crowding him into a corner. You would think nature had done amply well by the skunk, but no, the hydrophobic skunk comes along and upsets all these calculations. Besides carrying the traveling credentials of an ordinary skunk, he is rabid in the most rabidissimus form. He is not mad just part of the time, like one's relatives by marriage, and not mad most of the time, like an old-fashioned railroad ticket agent, but mad all the time, incurably, enthusiastically, and unanimously mad. He is mad, and he is glad of it. We made the acquaintance of the hydrophobic skunk when we rode down Hermit Trail. The casual visitor to the Grand Canyon first of all takes the Rim Drive. Then he essays Bright Angel Trail, which is sufficiently scary for his purposes until he gets used to it, and after that he grows more adventurous and tackles Hermit Trail, which is a marvel of corkscrew convolutions, gimleting its way down this red abdominal wound of a canyon to the very gizzard of the world. Here Johnny, our guide, felt moved to speech, and we hearkened to his words, and hungered for more, for Johnny knows the ranges of the Northwest as a city dweller knows his own little side street. In the fall of the year Johnny comes down to the canyon and serves as a guide a while, and then, when he gets so he just can't stand associating with tourists any longer, he packs his war bags and journeys back to the northern range, and enjoys the company of cows a spell. Cows are not exactly exciting, but they don't ask fool questions. A highly competent young person is Johnny, and a cow-puncher of parts. Most of the canyon guides are cow-punchers, accomplished ones, too, and of high standing in the profession. With a touch of reverence Johnny pointed out to us Sam Scoville, the greatest bronco-buster of his time, now engaged in piloting tourists. "Can he ride?" echoed Johnny in answer to our question. "Scoville could ride an earthquake if she stood still long enough for him to mount. He rode Steamboat, not young Steamboat, but old Steamboat. He rode rocking chair, and he's the only man that ever did that and was not called on in a couple of days to attend his own funeral." We went on and on at a lazy mule trot, hearing the unwritten annals of the range from one who had seen them enacted at first hand. Pretty soon we passed a herd of burros with mealy, dusty noses and spotty hides, feeding on prickly pears with rock lichens, and just before sunset we slid down the last declivity out upon the plateau and came to a camp, as was a camp. This was roughing it de luxe, with the most deluxey vengeance. Here were 3 tents, or rather 3 canvas houses, with wooden half walls, and they were spick and span inside and out, and had glass windows in them, and doors, and matched wooden floors. The mess tent was provided with a table and a clean cloth to go over it, and there were china dishes and china cups and shiny knives, forks, and spoons. Bill was in charge of the camp, a dark, rangy, good-looking leading man of a cowboy, wearing his blue shirt and his red neckerchief with an air. That Johnny certainly could cook. Served on china dishes upon a cloth-covered table, we had mounds of fried steaks and shoals of fried bacon, and a bushel, more or less, of shepherded potatoes, and green peas, and sliced peaches out of cans, and sourdough biscuits as light as kisses and much more filling, and fresh butter and fresh milk, and coffee as black as your hat and strong as sin. How easy it is for civilized man to become primitive and comfortable in his way of eating, especially if he has just ridden 10 miles on a buckboard and 9 more on a mule, and is away down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and there is nobody to look on disapprovingly when he takes a bite that would be a credit to a steam shovel. Despite all reports to the contrary, I wish to state that it is no trouble at all to eat green peas off a knife blade. You merely mix them in with potatoes for a cement, and fried steak, take it from an old steak eater, tastes best when eaten with those tools of nature's own providing, both hands and your teeth. An hour passed, busy yet pleasant, and we were both gorged to the gills and had reared back with our cigars lit to enjoy a third jorum of black coffee apiece, when Johnny, speaking in an offhand way to Bill, who was still hiding away biscuits inside of himself, like a parlor prestidigitator, said, "Seen any of those old hydrophobies the last day or two?" "Not so many," said Bill casually. "There was a couple out last night, pirating around in the moonlight. I reckon, though, there'll be quite a flock of 'em out tonight. A new moon always seems to fetch 'em up from the river." Both of us quit blowing on our coffee, and we put the cups down. I think I was the one who spoke. "I beg your pardon," I asked, "but what did you say would be out tonight?" "We were just speaking to one another about those hydrophobic skunks," said Bill apologetically. "This here canyon is where they mostly hang out and frolic round." I laid down my cigar, too. I admit I was interested. "Oh," I said softly like that. "Is it? Do they?" "Yes," said Johnny. "I reckon there's liable to be one come shoving his old nose into that door any minute, or probably 2. They mostly travel in pairs, sets as you might say." "You'd know one the minute you saw him, though," said Bill. "They're smaller than a regular skunk, and spotted where the other kind is striped, and they got little red eyes. You won't have no trouble at all recognizing one." It was at this juncture that we both got up and moved back by the stove. It was warmer there, and the chill of evening seemed to be settling down noticeably. "Funny thing about hydrophobic skunks," went on Johnny after a moment of pensive thought. "Mad, you know." "What makes them mad?" The 2 of us asked the question together. "Born that way," explained Bill. "Mad from the start, and won't never do nothing to get shut of it." "Ahem. They never attack humans, I suppose?" "Don't they?" said Johnny, as if surprised at such ignorance. "Why, humans is their favorite pastime. Humans is just pie to a hydrophobic skunk. It ain't really fun to be bit by a hydrophobic skunk, neither." He raised his coffee cup to his lips and imbibed deeply. "Which you certainly said something then, Johnny," stated Bill. "You see," he went on, turning to us, "they aim to catch you asleep, and they creep up right soft and take holt of you, take holt of a year usually, and clamp their teeth and just hang on for further orders. Some says they hang on till it thunders, same as snapping turtles. but that's a lie, I judge, because there's weeks on a stretch down here when it don't thunder. All the cases I ever heard of, they let go at sun-up." "It is right painful at the time," said Johnny, taking up the thread of the narrative, "and then in 9 days you go mad yourself. Remember that fellow the Hydrophobic Skunk bit down here by the rapids, Bill? Let's see now, what was that hombre's name?" "Williams," supplied Bill. "Heck Williams. I saw him at Flagstaff when they took him there to the hospital. That guy certainly did carry on regardless. First he went mad, and his eyes turned red, and he got so he didn't have no real use for water. Well, them prospectors don't never care much about water anyway. And then he got to snapping and biting and foaming, so they had to strap him down to his bed. He got loose, though." "Broke loose, I suppose," I said. "No, he bit loose," said Bill with the air of one who would not deceive you even in a matter of small details. "Do you mean to say he bit those leather straps in two?" "No, sir, he couldn't reach them," explained Bill, "so he bit the bed in two. Not in one bite, of course," he went on. "It took him several. I saw him after he was laid out. He really wasn't no credit to himself as a corpse." I'm not sure, but I think my companion and I were holding hands by now. Outside we could hear that little lost echo laughing to itself. It was no time to be laughing, either. Under certain circumstances I don't know of a lonelier place anywhere on earth than that Grand Canyon. Presently my friend spoke, and it seemed to me his voice was a mite husky. Well, he had a bad cold. "You said they mostly attack persons who are sleeping out, didn't you?" "That's right, too," said Johnny, and Bill nodded in affirmation. "Then, of course, since we sleep indoors, everything will be all right," I put in. "Well, yes and no," answered Johnny. "In the early part of the evening a hydrophobe is liable to do a lot of prowling round outdoors, but toward morning they like to get into camps. They dig under the side walls or come up through the floor, and they seem to prefer to get in bed with you. They're cold-blooded, I reckon, same as rattlesnakes. Cool nights always do drive 'em in, seems like." "It's going to be a sort of coolish night tonight," said Bill casually. It certainly was. I don't remember chillier night in years. My teeth were chattering a little, from cold, before we turned in. I retired with all my clothes on, including my boots and leggings, and I wished I had brought along my earmuffs. I also buttoned my watch into my left-hand shirt pocket, the idea being, if for any reason I should conclude to move during the night, I would be fully equipped for traveling. The door would not stay closely shut. The door jamb had sagged a little, and the wind kept blowing the door ajar. But after a while we dozed off. It was 1:27 a.m. when I woke with a violent start. I know this was the exact time, because that was when my watch stopped. I peered about me in the darkness. The door was wide open, I could tell that. Down on the floor there was a dragging, scuffling sound, and from almost beneath me a pair of small red eyes peered up phosphorescently. "He's here!" I said to my companion as I emerged from my blankets, and he, waking instantly, seemed instinctively to know whom I meant. I used to wonder at the ease with which a cockroach can climb a perfectly smooth wall and run across the ceiling. I know now that to do this is the easiest thing in the world, if you have the proper incentive behind you. I had gone up one wall of the tent and crossed over, and was in the act of coming down the other side when Bill burst in, his eyes blurred with sleep, a lighted lamp in one hand and a gun in the other. I never was so disappointed in my life, because it wasn't a hydrophobic skunk at all. It was a pack rat, sometimes called a trade rat, paying us a visit. The pack or trade rat is also a denizen of the Grand Canyon. He is about 4 times as big as an ordinary rat, and has an appetite to correspond. He sometimes invades your camp and makes free with your things, but he never steals anything outright. He merely trades with you, hence his name. He totes off a side of meat or a bushel of meal, and brings a cactus stalk in. Or he will confiscate your saddlebag, and leave you in exchange a nice dry chip. He is honest, but from what I can gather, he never gets badly stuck on a deal. Next morning, at breakfast, Johnny and Bill were doing a lot of laughing between them. over something or other. End of The Hydrophobic Skunk by Irvin S. Cobb. Read by Lynne Thompson. The Ole Virginia by Stuart Edward White. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. The Ole Virginia by Stuart Edward White. The ring around the sun had thickened all day long, and the turquoise blue of the Arizona sky had filmed. Storms in the dry countries are infrequent but heavy, and this surely meant storm. We had ridden since sunup over broad mesas, down and out of deep canyons, along the base of the mountains in the wildest parts of the territory. The cattle were winding leisurely toward the high country. The jackrabbits had disappeared, the quail lacked. We did not see a single antelope in the open. "It's a case of hold up," the cattleman ventured his opinion. "I have a ranch over in the Double R. Charlie and Windy Bill hold it down. We'll tackle it. What do you think?" The four cowboys agreed. We dropped into a low, broad watercourse, ascended its bed to big cottonwoods and flowing water, followed it into box canyons between rim rock carved fantastically and painted like a Moorish facade, until at last, in a widening below a rounded hill, we came upon an adobe house, a fruit tree, and a round corral. This was the Double R. Charlie and Windy Bill welcomed us with soda biscuits. We turned our horses out, spread our beds on the floor, filled our pipes, and squatted on our heels. Various dogs of various breeds investigated us. It was very pleasant, and we did not mind the ring around the sun. "Somebody else is coming," announced the cattleman finally. "Uncle Jim," said Charlie, after a glance. A hawk-faced old man with a long white beard and long white hair rode out from the cottonwoods. He had on a battered broad hat abnormally high of crown, carried across his saddle a heavy 8-square rifle, and was followed by a half-dozen lolloping hounds. The largest and fiercest of the latter, catching sight of our group, launched himself with lightning rapidity at the biggest of the ranch dogs, promptly nailed that canine by the back of the neck, shook him violently a score of times, flung him aside, and pounced on the next. During the ensuing few moments that hound was the busiest thing in the West. He satisfactorily whipped 4 dogs, pursued 2 cats up a tree, upset the Dutch oven and the rest of the soda biscuits, stampeded the horses, and raised a cloud of dust adequate to represent the smoke of battle. We others were too paralyzed to move. Uncle Jim sat placidly on his white horse, his thin knees bent over the oxbow stirrups, smoking. In 10 seconds the trouble was over, principally because there was no more trouble to make. The hound returned leisurely, licking from his chops the hair of his victims. Uncle Jim shook his head. "Trailer," he said sadly, "is a little severe." We agreed heartily, and turned in to welcome Uncle Jim with a fresh batch of soda biscuits. The old man was one of the typical long hairs. He had come from the Galiuro Mountains in '69, and since '69 he had remained in the Galiuro Mountains, spite of man or the devil. At present he possessed some hundreds of cattle, which he was reputed to water in a dry season from an ordinary dishpan. In times past he had prospected. That evening, the severe trailer having dropped to slumber, he held forth on big game hunting and dogs, quartz claims and Apaches. "Did you ever have any close calls?" I asked. He ruminated a few moments, refilled his pipe with some awful tobacco, and told the following experience. "In the time of Geronimo I was living just about where I do now, and that was just about in line with the raiding. You see, Geronimo and Jew and Old Loco used to pile out of the reservation at Camp Apache, raid south to the line, slip over into Mexico when the soldiers got too promiscuous, and raid there until they got ready to come back. Then there was always a big medicine talk. Says Geronimo, 'I am tired of the warpath.' I will come back from Mexico with all my warriors, if you will escort me with soldiers and protect my people." "All right," said the general, being only too glad to get him back at all. So then in 10 minutes there wouldn't be a buck in camp, but next morning they shows up again, each with about 50 head of hosses. "Where'd you get those hosses?" asked the general, suspicious. "Had 'em pastured in the hills," answered Geronimo. "I can't take all those hosses with me. I believe they're stolen," said the general. "My people cannot go without their hosses," says Geronimo. So across the line they goes, and back to the reservation. In about a week there's 52 frantic greasers wanting to know where's their hosses. The army is nothing but an importer of stolen stock, and knows it, and can't help it. Well, as I says, I'm between Camp Apache and the Mexican line, so that every raiding party goes right on past me. The point is that I'm 1,000 feet or so above the valley, and the renegades is in such a hurry about that time that they never stop to climb up and collect me. Often I've watched them trailing down the valley in a cloud of dust. Then in a day or two a squad of soldiers would come up and camp at my spring for a while. They used to send soldiers to guard every water hole in the country, so the renegades couldn't get water. After a while, from not being bothered none, I got to thinking I wasn't worth while to them. Me and Johnny Hooper were pecking away at the Ole Virginia mine then. We got down about 60 feet, all timbered, and was thinking of cross-cutting. One day Johnny went to town, and that same day I got in a hurry and left my gun at camp. I worked all the morning down at the bottom of the shaft, and when I see by the sun it was getting along towards noon, I put in 3 good shots, tamped 'em down, lit the fuses, and started to climb out. It ain't no ways pleasant to light a fuse in a shaft and then have to climb about a 50-foot ladder with it burning behind you. I never did get used to it. You keep thinking, now s'pose there's a flaw in that fuse or something, and she goes off in 6 seconds instead of 2 minutes. Where'll you be then? It would give you a good boost towards your home on high, anyway. So I climbed fast, and stuck my head out the top without looking, and then I froze solid enough. There, about 50 feet away, climbing up the hill on mighty tired hosses, was a dozen of the ugliest Chiricahuas you ever don't want to meet, and in addition a Mexican renegade named Maria, who was worse than any of 'em. I see at once their hosses was tired out, and they had a notion of camping at my waterhole, not knowing nothing about the Ole Virginia mine. For 2 bits I'd have let go all holts and dropped backwards, trusting to my thick head for easy lighting. Then I heard a little fizz and sputter from below. At that my hair riz right up so I could feel the breeze below under my hat. For about 6 seconds I stood there like an imbecile, grinning amiably. Then one of the Chiricahuas made a sort of grunt, and I said that they'd seen the original exhibit your Uncle Jim was making of himself. Then that fuse gave another sputter, and one of the Apaches said, "Unda." That means white man. It was harder to turn my head than if I'd had a stiff neck, but I managed to do it, and I see that my ore dump wasn't more than 10 foot away. I mighty near overjumped it, and the next I knew I was on one side of it and those Apaches on the other. Probably I flew, leastways I don't seem to remember jumping. That didn't seem to do me much good. The renegades were grinning and laughing to think how easy a thing they had, and I couldn't rightly think up any arguments against the notion, at least from their standpoint. They were chattering away to each other in Mexican for the benefit of Maria. Oh, they had me all distributed down to my suspender buttons, and me squatting behind that ore dump about as formidable as a brush rabbit. Then, all at once, one of my shots went off down in the shaft. "Boom," says she, plenty big, and a slather of rocks and stones came out of the mouth and began to dump down promiscuous on the scenery. I got one little one in the shoulder blade, and found time to wish my ore dump had a roof. And those renegades caught it square in the thick of trouble. One got knocked out entirely for a minute by a nice piece of country rock in the head. "Otra vez," yells I, which means again. "Boom," goes the Ole Virginia, prompt as an answer. I put in my time dodging, but when I gets a chance to look, the Apaches has all got to cover and is looking scared. "Otra vez," yells I again. "Boom," says the Ole Virginia. This was the biggest shot of the lot, and she surely cut loose. I ought to have been halfway up the hill, watching things from a safe distance, but I wasn't. Lucky for me, the shaft was a little on the drift, so she didn't quite shoot my way. But she distributed about a ton over those renegades. They sort of half got to their feet, uncertain. "Otra vez!" yells I once more, as bold as if I could keep her shooting all day. It was just a cold, raw blazer, and if I didn't go through I could see me as an Apache parlor ornament. But it did. Those Chiricahuas gave one yell and skipped, and it was surely a funny sight, after they got aboard their war ponies, to see them trying to dig out on horses too tired to trot. I didn't stop to get all the laughs, though. In fact, I give one jump off that ledge, and I lit a running. A quarter hoss couldn't have beat me to that shack. There I grabbed my good old gun and meat in the pot, and made a climb for the tall country. Uncle Jim stopped with an air of finality and began lazily to refill his pipe. From the open mud fireplace he picked a coal. Outside, the rain, faithful to the prophecy of the wide-ringed sun, beat fitfully against the roof. "That was the closest call I ever had," he said at last. End of The Old Virginia, by Stuart Edward White. Recording by Lynne Thompson.
The $1,000,000 Freight Train by Frank H. Spearman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It was the second month of the strike, and not a pound of freight had been moved. Things did look smoky on the West End. The general superintendent happened to be with us when the news came. "You can't handle it, boys," said he nervously. "What you better do is turn it over to the Columbian Pacific." Our contracting freight agent on the coast at that time was a fellow so erratic that he was nicknamed Crazy Horse. Right in the midst of the strike, Crazy Horse wired that he had secured a big silk shipment for New York. We were paralyzed. We had no engineers, no firemen, and no motive power to speak of. The strikers were pounding our men, wrecking our trains, and giving us the worst of it generally, that is, when we couldn't give it to them. Why the fellow displayed his activity at that particular juncture still remains a mystery. Perhaps he had a grudge against the road. If so, he took an artful revenge. Everybody on the system with ordinary railroad sense knew that our struggle was to keep clear of the freight business until we got rid of our strike. Anything valuable or perishable was especially unwelcome. But the stuff was docked and loaded and consigned in our care before we knew it. After that, a refusal to carry it would be like hoisting the white flag, and that is something which never yet flew over the West End. "Turn it over to the Columbian," said the general superintendent, but the general superintendent was not looked up to on our division. He hadn't enough sand. Our head was a fighter, and he gave tone to every man under him. "No," he thundered, bringing down his fist, "not in 1,000 years. We'll move it ourselves. Wire Montgomery, the general manager, that we will take care of it, and wire him to fire Crazy Horse and to do it right off." And before the silk was turned over to us, Crazy Horse was looking for another job. It is the only case on record where a freight hustler was discharged for getting business. There were 12 carloads. It was insured for $85,000 a car. You can figure how far the title is wrong, but you can never estimate the worry the stuff gave us. It looked as big as $12 million worth. In fact, one scrub car link with the glory of the West End at heart had a fight over the amount with a skeptical hostler. He maintained that the actual money value was 120 millions, but I give you the figures just as they went over the wire, and they are right. What bothered us most was that the strikers had the tip almost as soon as we had it. Having friends on every road in the country, they knew as much about our business as we ourselves. The minute it was announced that we should move the silk, they were after us. It was a defiance, a last one. If we could move freight, for we were already moving passengers after a fashion, the strike might be well accounted beaten. Stewart, the leader of the local contingent, together with his followers, got after me at once. "You don't show much sense, Reed," said he. "You fellows here are breaking your necks to get things moving, and when this strike is over, if our boys ask for your discharge, they'll get it. This road can't run without our engineers. We're going to beat you. If you dare try to move this silk, we'll have your scalp when it's over. You'll never get your silk to Zanesville, I'll promise you that. And if you ditch it and make $1 million loss, you'll get let out anyway, my buck." "I'm here to obey orders, Stewart," said I. What was the use of more? I felt uncomfortable, but we had determined to move the silk. There was no more to be said. When I went over to the roundhouse and told Neighbor the decision, he said never a word, but he looked a great deal. Neighbor's task was to supply the motive power. All that we had, uncrippled, was in the passenger service, because passengers should be taken care of first of all. In order to win a strike, you must have public opinion on your side. "Nevertheless, Neighbor," said I, after we had talked a while, "we must move the silk also." Neighbor studied. Then he roared at his foreman. "Send Bartholomew Mullen here." He spoke with a decision that made me think the business was done. I had never happened, it is true, to hear of Bartholomew Mullen in the Department of Motive Power, but the impression the name gave me was of a monstrous fellow, big as Neighbor, or Old Man Sankey, or Dad Hamilton. "I'll put Bartholomew ahead of it," said Neighbor tightly. I saw a boy walk into the office. "Mr. Garden said you wanted to see me, sir," said he, addressing the master mechanic. "I do, Bartholomew," responded Neighbor. The figure in my mind's eye shrunk in a twinkling. Then it occurred to me that it must be this boy's father who was wanted. "You have been begging for a chance to take out an engine, Bartholomew," began Neighbor coldly, and I knew it was on. "Yes, sir. You want to get killed, Bartholomew." Bartholomew smiled as if the idea was not altogether displeasing. "How would you like to go pilot tomorrow for McCurdy? You to take the 44 and run as first 78. McCurdy will run as second 78. "I know I could run an engine all right," ventured Bartholomew, as if Neighbor were the only one taking the chances in giving him an engine. "I know the track from here to Zanesville. I helped McNeff fire one week." "Then go home and go to bed, and be over here at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, and sleep sound, for it may be your last chance." It was plain that the master mechanic hated to do it. It was simply sheer necessity. "He's a wiper," mused Neighbor, as Bartholomew walked springily away. "I took him in here sweeping 2 years ago. He ought to be firing now, but the union held him back. That's why he don't like them. He knows more about an engine now than half the lodge." "They'd better have let him in," said the master mechanic grimly. "He may be the means of breaking their backs yet. If I give him an engine and he runs it, I'll never take him off, union or no union, strike or no strike." "How old is that boy?" I asked. 18, and never a kith or a kin that I know of. Bartholomew Mullen," mused Neighbor, as the slight figure moved across the flat. "Big name, small boy. Well, Bartholomew, you know something more by tomorrow night about running an engine, or a whole lot less. That's as it happens. If he gets killed, it's your fault, Reed." He meant that I was calling on him for men when he couldn't supply them. "I heard once," he went on, "about a fellow named Bartholomew being mixed up in a massacre, but I take it he must have been an older man than our Bartholomew, nor his other name wasn't Mullen, neither. I disremember just what it was, but it wasn't Mullen." "Well, don't say I want to get the boy killed, Neighbor," I protested. "I've got plenty to answer for. I'm here to run trains. When there are any to run, that's murder enough for me." "You needn't send Bartholomew out on my account. Give him a slow schedule, and I'll give him orders to jump early. That's all we can do. If the strikers don't ditch him, he'll get through somehow." It stuck in my crop, the idea of putting that boy on a pilot engine to take all the dangers ahead of that particular train. But I had a good deal else to think of besides. From the minute the silk got into the McLeod yards, We posted double guards around. About 12 o'clock that night, we held a council of war, which ended in our running the train into the out freight house. The result was that by morning we had a new train made up. It consisted of 14 refrigerator cars loaded with oranges, which had come in mysteriously the night before. It was announced that the silk would be held for the present, and the oranges rushed through at once. Bright and early, the refrigerator train was run down to the ice houses, and 20 men were put to work icing the oranges. At 7 o'clock, McCurdy pulled in the local passenger with engine 105. Our plan was to cancel the load and run him right out with the oranges. When he got in, he reported that the 105 had sprung a tire. This threw us out entirely. There was a hurried conference in the roundhouse. "What can you do?" asked the superintendent in desperation. "There's only one thing I can do. Put Bartholomew Mullen on it with the 44, and put McCurdy to bed for the number 2 tonight," responded Neighbor. I looked into the locomotive stalls. The first, the only man in sight was Bartholomew Mullen. He was very busy polishing the 44. He had good steam on her, and the old tub was wheezing away as if she had the asthma. The 44 was old, she was homely, she was rickety, but Bartholomew Mullen wiped her battered nose as deferentially as if she had been a spick-span, spider driver, tail truck mail racer. She wasn't much, the 44, but in those days Bartholomew wasn't much, and the 44 was Bartholomew's. "How was she steaming, Bartholomew?" I sang out. He was right in the middle of her. Looking up, he fingered his waist modestly and blushed through a dab of crude petroleum over his eye. "130 pounds, sir. She's a terrible free steamer, the old 44. I'm all ready to run her out. Who's marked up to fire for you, Bartholomew?" Bartholomew Mullen looked at me fraternally. "Neighbor couldn't give me anybody but a wiper, sir," said Bartholomew in a sort of a wouldn't that kill you tone. The unconscious arrogance of the boy quite knocked me. So soon had honors changed his point of view. Last night a despised wiper, at daybreak an engineer, and his nose in the air at the idea of taking on a wiper for fireman. And all so innocent. "Would you object, Bartholomew," I suggested gently, "to a train master for firemen?" "I don't think so, sir." "Thank you, because I am going down to Zanesville this morning myself, and I thought I'd ride with you. Is that all right?" "Oh, yes, sir, if Neighbor doesn't care." I smiled. He didn't know whom Neighbor took orders from, but he thought, evidently, not from me. "Then run her down to the oranges, Bartholomew, and couple on, and we'll order ourselves out, see?" The 44 looked like a baby carriage when we got her in front of the refrigerators. However, after the necessary preliminaries, we gave a very sporty toot and pulled out. In a few minutes we were sailing down the valley. For 50 miles we bobbed along with our cargo of iced silk as easy as old shoes, for I need hardly explain that we had packed the silk into the refrigerators to confuse the strikers. The great risk was that they would try to ditch us. I was watching the track as a mouse would a cat, looking every minute for trouble. We cleared the Gumbo Cut west of the Beaver at a pretty good clip, in order to make the grade on the other side. The bridge there is hidden in summer by a grove of hackberries. I had just pulled open to cool her a bit when I noticed how high the backwater was on each side of the track. Suddenly I felt the fill going soft under the drivers, felt the 44 wobble and slew. Bartholomew shut off hard and threw the air as I sprang to the window. The peaceful little creek ahead looked as angry as the Platte in April water, and the bottoms were a lake. Somewhere up the valley there had been a cloudburst, for overhead the sun was bright. The Beaver was roaring over its banks, and the bridge was out. Bartholomew screamed for brakes. It looked as if we were against it, and hard. A soft track to stop on, a torrent of storm water ahead, and $100,000 worth of silk behind, not to mention equipment. I yelled at Bartholomew and motioned for him to jump. My conscience is clear on that point. The 44 was stumbling along, trying like a drunken man to hang on to the rotten track. "Bartholomew!" I yelled. but he was head out and looking back at his train while he jerked frantically at the air lever. I understood. The air wouldn't work. It never will on those old tubs when you need it. The sweat pushed out on me. I was thinking how much the silk would bring us after the bath in the Beaver. Bartholomew stuck to his levers like a man in a signal tower, but every second brought us closer to open water. Watching him intent only on saving his first train, heedless of life, I was actually ashamed to jump. While I hesitated, he somehow got the brakes to set. The old 44 bucked like a bronco. It wasn't too soon. She checked her train nobly at the last, but I saw nothing could keep her from the drink. I gave Bartholomew a terrific slap, and again I yelled. Then, turning to the gangway, I dropped into the soft mud on my side. The 44 hung low, and it was easy lighting. Bartholomew sprang from his seat a second later, but his blouse caught in the teeth of the quadrant. He stooped quick as thought and peeled the thing over his head. Then he was caught fast by the wristbands, and the ponies of the 44 tipped over the broken abutment. Pull as he would, he couldn't get free. The pilot dipped into the torrent slowly, but losing her balance, the 44 kicked her heels into the air like lightning and shot with a frightened wheeze plump into the creek, dragging her engineer with her. The head car stopped on the brink. Running across the track, I looked for Bartholomew. He wasn't there. I knew he must have gone down with his engine. Throwing off my gloves, I dived, just as I stood, close to the tender, which hung half submerged. I am a good bit of a fish underwater, but no self-respecting fish would be caught in that yellow mud. I realized, too, the instant I struck the water, that I should have dived on the upstream side. The current took me away whirling. When I came up for air, I was 50 feet below the pier. I scrambled out, feeling it was all up with Bartholomew. But to my amazement, as I shook my eyes open, the train crew were running forward, and there stood Bartholomew on the track above me, looking at the refrigerator. When I got to him, he explained how he was dragged under and had to tear the sleeve out of his blouse under water to get free. The surprise is how little fuss men make about such things when they are busy. It took only 5 minutes for the conductor to hunt up a coil of wire and a sounder for me, and by the time he got forward with it, Bartholomew was halfway up a telephone pole to help me cut into a live wire. Fast as I could, I rigged a pony and began calling the McLeod dispatcher. It was rocky sending, but after no end of pounding, I got him and gave orders for the wrecking gang and for one more of Neighbor's rapidly decreasing supply of locomotives. Bartholomew, sitting on a strip of fence which still rose above the water, looked forlorn. To lose in the Beaver the first engine he had ever handled was tough, and he was evidently speculating on his chances of ever getting another. If there weren't tears in his eyes, there was storm water certainly. But after the relief engine had pulled what was left of us back 6 miles to a siding, I made it my first business to explain to Neighbor, who was nearly beside himself, that Bartholomew not only was not at fault, but that by his nerve he had actually saved the train. "I'll tell you, Neighbor," I suggested when we got straightened around. "Give us the 109 to go ahead as pilot and run her around the river division with Foley and the 216. "What'll you do with the number 6, growled Neighbor. 6 was the local passenger west. "Annul it west of McLeod, said I instantly. "We've got this silk on our hands now, and I'd move it if it tied up every passenger train on the division. If we can get the stuff through, it will practically beat the strike. If we fail, it will beat the company." By the time we had backed to Newhall Junction, Neighbor had made up his mind my way. Mullen and I climbed into the 109, and Foley, with the 216, and none too good a grace, coupled onto the silk, and flying red signals, we started again for Zanesville over the river division. Foley was always full of mischief. He had a better engine than ours, and he took great satisfaction the rest of the afternoon in crowding us. Every mile of the way he was on our heels. I was throwing the coal and have reason to remember. It was after dark when we reached the Beverly Hill, and we took it at a lively pace. The strikers were not on our minds then. It was Foley who bothered. When the long parallel steel lines of the upper yard spread before us, flashing under the arc lights, we were way above yard speed. Running a locomotive into one of those big yards is like shooting a rapid in a canoe. There is a bewildering maze of tracks, lighted by red and green lamps, which must be watched the closest to keep out of trouble. The hazards are multiplied the minute you pass the throat, and a yard wreck is a dreadful tangle. It makes everybody from roadmaster to flagman furious, and not even Bartholomew wanted to face an inquiry on a yard wreck. On the other hand, he couldn't afford to be caught by Foley, who was chasing him out of pure caprice. I saw the boy holding the throttle at a half and fingering the air anxiously as we jumped over the frogs, but the roughest riding on track so far beats the ties as a cushion that when the 109 suddenly struck her paws through an open switch, we bounced against the roof of the cab like footballs. I grabbed a brace with one hand and with the other reached instinctively across to Bartholomew's side to seize the throttle. But as I tried to shut him off, he jerked it wide open in spite of me and turned with lightning in his eye. "No!" he cried, and his voice rang hard. The 109 took the tremendous shove at her back and leaped like a frightened horse. Away we went across the yard, through the cinders and over the ties. My teeth have never been the same since. I don't belong on an engine anyway, and since then I have kept off. At the moment, I was convinced that the strain had been too much, that Bartholomew was stark crazy. He sat clinging like a lobster to his levers and bouncing clear to the roof. But his strategy was dawning on me. In fact, he was pounding it into me. Even the shock and scare of leaving the track and tearing up the yard had not driven from Bartholomew's noodle the most important feature of our situation, which was, above everything, to keep out of the way of the silk train. I felt every moment more mortified at my attempt to shut him off. I had done the trick of the woman who grabs the reins. It was even better to tear up the yard than to stop for Foley to smash into and scatter the silk over the cold chutes. Bartholomew's decision was one of the traits which make the runner, instant perception coupled to instant resolve. The ordinary dub thinks what he should have done to avoid disaster after it is all over. Bartholomew thought before. On we bumped across frogs, through switches, over splits, and into target rods when, and this is the miracle of it all, the 109 got her forefeet on a split switch, made a contact, and after a slew or two, like a bogged horse, she swung up sweet on the rails again, tender and all. Bartholomew shut off with an undercut that brought us up stuttering, and nailed her feet with the air right where she stood. We had left the track and plowed 100 feet across the yards and jumped onto another track. It is the only time I ever heard of its happening anywhere, but I was on the engine with Bartholomew Mullen when it was done. Foley choked his train the instant he saw our hind lights bobbing. We climbed down and ran back. He had stopped just where we should have stood if I had shut off. Bartholomew ran to the switch to examine it. The contact light, green, still burned like a false beacon, and lucky it did, for it showed that the switch had been tampered with and exonerated Bartholomew Mullen completely. The attempt of the strikers to spill the silk in the yards had only made the reputation of a new engineer. 30 minutes later, the $1 million train was turned over to the east end to wrestle with, and we breathed, all of us, a good bit easier. Bartholomew Mullen, now a passenger runner who ranks with Kennedy and Jack Moore and Foley and George Sinclair himself, got a personal letter from the general manager complimenting him on his pretty wit, and he was good enough to say nothing whatever about mine. We registered that night and went to supper together, Foley, Jackson, Bartholomew, and I. After we dropped into the dispatcher's office, something was coming from a cloud, but the operator, to save his life, couldn't catch it. I listened a minute. It was Neighbor. Now, Neighbor isn't great on dispatching trains. He can make himself understood over the poles, but his sending is like a boy sawing wood, sort of uneven. However, though I am not much on running yards, I claim to be able to take the wildest ball that ever was thrown along the wire, and the chair was tendered me at once to catch Neighbor's extraordinary passes at the McLeod Key. They came something like this. To OPR, tell massacre. That was the word that stuck them all, and I could perceive that Neighbor was talking emphatically. He had apparently forgotten Bartholomew's last name, and was trying to connect with the one that he had disremembered the night before. Tell Massacre, repeated Neighbor, that he is all right. Tell him I give him double mileage for today all the way through, and tomorrow he gets the 109 to keep. Neighbor. End of The $1 Million Freight Train by Frank H. Spearman.